meeting of the City of Victoria Planning Commission, regular meeting to order. I believe the first item on the agenda is training for planning commissioners, and I'd like to recognize our city attorney, Mr. Guas.
Good evening. My name is Thomas Gush. Most of you know me already. I am the city attorney, and this is supposed to move when I hit that button, so we'll have to figure out why it's not doing that.
I can't hear him that well.
You can't hear me that well?
No, sir.
We'll put that a little closer then.
All right.
All right. Happy New Year to everyone. I know it's September 20th, but it is also the first meeting of the new year of the Planning Commission, which is why we're starting off with appointments of new members, and we have swearing in of officers tonight. And that's sort of also the reason that I'm here tonight talking to you, is as a way to kick off the new year and set a new foundation for what's coming up ahead. Some of you already know there's potentially big changes coming down the road. There's a committee that's meeting to review all of the development codes, all of the procedures in place, and potentially unify all of that into the Unified Development Code. And when that comes back, that's going to be a significant amount of change, at least in the way things are set out for us. And I firmly believe that it's much easier to move forward when you're standing on solid ground. And so our goal in starting off this year with some more targeted training is to make sure that everybody's on the same page, to make sure we're all standing in the firm foundation so that when those changes come along down the horizon, we're ready to start moving ahead. All right? I do expect that those changes will be coming along in this year, and hopefully they're going to be bringing great things. We'll see what happens. All right, now that I'm pushing the right button, we can move forward. We've got 4 topics we want to cover tonight, all right? And I've got them, if y'all's screens are on in front of you, can y'all see that there, or is it just behind you? Okay, good. So we've got the Open Meetings Act we're going to talk about very briefly, 30,000-foot level. I'm going to spend a fair amount of time talking about Robert's Rules of Procedure. We're going to talk about the legal standards in the local government code for adopting plats, which of course is a major part of your work. And then we're going to talk about the local criteria for granting variances to those plats. So for the most part, this is going to be a review of things we already know. But I remember the story of a college football coach, and I can't remember which one it was. I want to say it was the Michigan Wolverines coach, who started off his football season by saying, all right, guys, how big is a football field? Well, it's 100 yards long, right? No, how wide is it? Where are the hash marks? How wide are the goalposts? If we don't have a firm kind of foundation to stand on, how can we expect to move forward together as a team? And so even though this is something that most of you have been doing a while, you know what you're doing. We want to make sure we're all on the same page moving forward. We've got that firm foundation so that we're prepared for the changes that are coming down the road. I'll put a little table of contents up here on the slide, and so you'll be able to see where we are as we go through the process of this training. And hopefully this shouldn't take too terribly long, 20, 30 minutes probably. Open Meetings Act first, foundational law. Let's talk about the 2 basic requirements of what the Open Meetings Act is. I should probably start by saying, yes, this is a body that exercises the sovereign function of government. The Open Meetings Act does apply to you guys and to this entire board. So the primary purpose of the Open Meetings Act is to make sure that this board deliberates its business in an open meeting to the public. We don't want, as a civilization, our governing bodies to be making decisions behind closed doors. And so the Open Meetings requires that you make those deliberations here. I'm very carefully using the word deliberate. That's the word out of the statute. And to deliberate in the statute means to pass communication between 2 people on a subject of business before the board, or that could potentially be before the board. That's a very broad term. Any communication that is given and received in any form, so that could be here at the dais, it could be in an email, it could be in a phone call, and we'll talk about how that can impact you as we get towards the bottom of this slide, all right? In order to make sure that the meeting really is open to the public, the statute requires that we give 72 hours notice to the public. That's for 2 reasons. First, gives them a chance to go read the agenda and know in advance what's going on at the meeting. And second, it requires us to post the topics, so that the public can decide whether they're interested in coming here and giving feedback or hearing what you have to say about those subjects. Once that agenda is posted to the public, you're not allowed to talk about other subjects at this meeting. The topic has to be on the agenda. The agenda has to be posted. Otherwise, the public doesn't have a fair opportunity to decide whether or not they want to come participate in the process. So that's the basic requirement of the Open Meetings Act. Of course, it was written by lawyers, so there's a lot of exceptions to it. We call those the closed meeting exceptions that allow you to go into executive session to talk about things that are confidential for one reason or another. So for example, if we were having an attorney-client privileged conversation and I can't share that information publicly without jeopardizing the attorney-client privilege, we have the right to adjourn that topic into an executive session. The topic still has to be on the agenda for the public to decide whether they want to be at the meeting, but we get to move into an executive session so that I don't jeopardize that attorney-client privilege. Finally, I want to point out to you that there are criminal penalties associated with the Open Meetings Act. Specifically, if a member of the board circumvents the act by meeting in numbers of less than a quorum in order to discuss business, that's essentially a Class C misdemeanor. It's actually a $500 fine and up to 6 months in jail, or both. If a member of the board participates in a closed meeting that is unlawful, again, $500 fine, up to 6 months in jail. If you participate in a closed meeting that does not have a certified agenda or a tape recording, that's up to a $500 fine. And finally, if you disclose the certified agenda or the tape recording outside of lawful practices, then you're looking at a Class B misdemeanor. So there are specific criminal penalties associated with the Open Meetings Act, and that's why I like to start with it, to make sure everyone is constantly reminded the state is serious about our governing bodies being open to the public. We want the public to have an opportunity to participate in the process. Now, most of those you're not going to need to be terribly worried about, because we're going to be injecting into this process, I shouldn't say injecting, we're offering into this process a lot more interaction from the legal department. I'd like to bring up briefly Allison Lacey. I almost said Allison Marek. I'm sorry, Allison.
It's new.
Allison is the assistant city attorney in our office, and many of you already know her as well. And she's going to be working closely with the planning department on these issues. And it's going to be her job to review the agenda before it gets published, to make sure it gets published. She'll be listening in on the conversations around the dais to make sure we're not wandering off of that. She's going to be keying in to make sure that you guys are staying on track with most of the things that are going on. And you're not going to need to worry about most of the Open Meetings Act. That'll get taken care of for you. Thank you, Allison. There is one part of it, though, that I want you to pay attention to, and that is the part where we're talking about circumvention. And I need to remind you of a phrase the Attorney General likes to use, a walking quorum. A walking quorum is any time that a communication is passed serially from one member of a board to another until it ultimately winds up meeting a quorum of the board. So if Michael tells John something about business, hey, I really think we ought to deny that permit tomorrow night. And then John passes it on to BJ, and BJ passes it on to James. That's 4. One more communication, you have a quorum, a majority of the board, that have shared that message. They might not have all been in the same room at the same time. That might have been a collection of phone calls and emails and face-to-face conversations. The Attorney General calls that a walking quorum, and it is a violation of the law. And if that is done intentionally to try to circumvent the law, criminal penalties can attach. The reason I draw that to your attention, of course, is because Allison's not going to be watching that. Those are the kind of communications that'll take place out in the public. And so it is up to each of you to be sure that you're complying with the act. The criminal sanctions run to the members of the body, not to the staff who is supporting them. So it is up to you to pay attention to that, all right? All right, that's the heavy stuff for the evening. We're going to move on out of the Open Meetings Act. By the way, if you have any questions about the Open Meetings Act, feel free to raise your hand, interrupt me, and ask anything you want to. I don't mind being interrupted. Yes, sir.
Sometimes I have to go down to the city and talk to them, and I'll be talking about something here. I need information.
That's
I
a great
can't do
clarification.
that.
That is a great clarification. The walking quorum applies between and among members of the board. It does not apply to communications outside of the board. You will sometimes get email communications from staff. Julie or Celeste may send you an email that says, here's what's going to happen at the meeting. That is a communication from staff to all of you, and it doesn't violate the act because it's not between you. Now, BJ, if you were to say reply to all on that email and reply to everybody, I don't like this particular application and I think we ought to deny it. Now you have shared a communication with the entire board, and that is a risk of a violation of the act. Does that make sense? But you see the distinction between communicating with staff versus communicating with other members of the board.
Sometimes we have to research something, we gotta ask questions in order
Yes.
to have the knowledge to be able to, do the right thing here.
I agree with you.
Okay.
You definitely do. And as long as those communications are with staff, you'll be fine.
Okay.
Okay. Let's move on and talk about Robert's Rules of Order. Robert's rules are not adopted by law. They're adopted by your bylaws. In your bylaws, I have to push the right button, which were adopted all the way back in 2013. It says the rules of procedure stated in Robert's Rules of Order, the current version, are what we're going to use to guide our meetings, okay? And so that is actually adopted, and we do have to follow Robert's rules. So I'm going to go over the basics of Robert's rules. Robert's is horribly complicated. You're probably going to realize you've been doing it wrong your whole life, and that's okay, all right? I'm also going to talk about some exceptions to Robert's rules that are going to kind of ease some of the burden that Robert's would otherwise place on us, all right? So, Robert's rules. I have to be very careful how I push the button or it doesn't move forward. Robert's Rules was actually created back in, I want to say the 1920s, by a military general. And it is very complicated. It is formulaic. It is formal. And it is designed to streamline meetings of very large bodies. Think the U.S. House of Representatives as an example. Now, the U.S. House of Representatives doesn't actually use Robert's Rules. They have their own rules of procedure. But if you picture that group in your head, it makes it easier to understand why the rules are so formulaic. For example, members of the body can only speak one time. If we allow everybody to speak as many times as they want to, we'd be there all day before we ever got a chance to vote on something, right? So there are very strict formulaic rules put in place, and then there are exceptions. Way back here towards the back of the book, I actually have a sticky on it in my version of the book. It's page 476. It says, these rules for a small board shall be applied only as far as practicable with the exceptions that are listed below. So as far as we can, and as far as it's useful to us, we need to follow Robert's rules. But there are very specific exceptions, and then even beyond those, we try to follow as far as it is useful for us, and if we need to vary from it, we can. What I'm going to talk about is primarily the formulaic rules, and then as we get to them, I'll go through and discuss some of the exceptions that make it much easier on us, all right? So the basics. You are the body, the 9 of you, 8 tonight. The 9 of you who make up the Planning Commission are the body, and you elect a presiding officer, or we will later this evening. The presiding officer in this body is called the chairperson, according to the bylaws, and the chairperson runs the meeting. They're the presiding officer. They have certain obligations. They recognize people to speak. They actually call the items in front of the, call the items to the floor, and they make sure that we're all following the agenda, which is the list of items. Now, unlike formal Robert's rules, the presiding officer of this board does vote. In formal Robert's rules, they cannot, only to break a tie. Here, the presiding officer does vote. In fact, the presiding officer can second a motion here. The presiding officer can even make the motion here. It is customary for the presiding officer not to make that motion out of a courtesy to the other board members to say, I entertain a motion to approve the next item on the agenda and to allow someone else to make the motion. And that is pure diplomacy. That is just a polite chair not trying to ramrod the meeting. But if no one else is taking any action, there is no problem at all with the chair making the motion him or herself. Make sense? All right. The agenda itself is actually the order of business for the day, and that is going to be easy for us. The Open Meetings Act requires that we have an agenda anyway, and those items are all going to be already listed on the agenda, so everyone knows what we're going to be talking about before you get to the meeting. Let's talk a little bit about the main motion. That's what Robert's Rules calls it, whenever you make a motion to approve something on the agenda. And the way you approve a main motion is that somebody has to make a motion to do this. Let me see your copy of your agenda right quick. The way that would happen in formal Robert's Rules is someone would have to say, I make a motion to approve a preliminary plat, 21 single-family residential R1 lots within Block 1 on a 6.59 acre tract. They'd have to read the whole thing. Then the chair waits for someone to second that motion, and then the chair formally rereads. We are now entertaining a motion to approve a preliminary and reads the whole thing all over again. That's a useful thing in a large body to make sure everybody hears and understands what's going on. Almost none of that is necessary in a body of this size. We make a motion so that we know what's being discussed and considered. And then the only purpose of a second, think about this, the only reason we have a second is to find out whether anybody else is interested in talking about this. If Brian brings up a topic and nobody else wants to talk about it, and nobody makes a second, the chair says, well, that item dies for lack of a second. We move on. We don't have to talk about what Brian wants to talk about. Nobody else wants to talk about it. That's the only reason that a second exists. I'm making an emphasis on that point because a lot of people believe that when you second something, you are voicing approval of it, or that when you make a motion in favor of something, you're voicing approval of it. Oftentimes, you can make a motion or a second in order to allow deliberation on that subject so that you can speak against it, and you are certainly allowed to vote against it. All right? So it is not a requirement that you vote in favor of something that you second. In fact, in a small board, the motion doesn't have to be seconded at all. One of the exceptions listed in here, you got a motion, somebody votes on it, it's fine. That is not a critical error. The rules specifically say you don't have a second. In fact, and this is really strange, the rules say that if the board is clear about the subject being considered, you don't even have to have a motion. Since we have everything listed on our agenda already, the chair could technically just say, item F1, can I have a vote? And you have complied with Robert's Rules, okay? Now, we don't typically do that. Out of courtesy, we wait for a motion and a second. We allow people to say their piece, all right? But nevertheless, Robert's Rules provides a lot more flexibility than most people are aware of for a board of this size. All right. Once we get past the motion and the second and we get into the deliberation section where people are talking about the motion, that's where things get difficult for Robert's Rules. That's where the procedural issues can take over the substantive issues. These are what we call subsidiary motions. You have a motion and a second on the floor, and now you have an opportunity to make a motion to amend. Motion to amend is the most common subsidiary motion. And a motion to amend means that we're going to change the subject that we're voting on. A motion to amend has to be seconded, and then it can be deliberated. And when you vote to approve the motion to amend, you're not approving the main motion. All that you're doing is changing the language of the main motion. Let me give you an example. Let's say the Planning Commission decides to buy Julie for her birthday a new desk for her office. All right? That motion is made by Michael. It's seconded by Gail. It is now on the board. But John wants to go further. So John makes a motion to amend to say, let's also buy her a chair. That motion gets seconded by Jill. When you vote to approve that amendment, you have not agreed to buy a desk and chair yet. All that you've done is you've changed the language of what you're now thinking about doing. Okay? You still have to go back and approve the original motion as amended. Now, you want to get really crazy? BJ wants to go even further. And so after the motion to amend to include the chair has been made, BJ says, I make a motion to amend that we buy a wooden chair, not a steel chair. A motion to amend can also be amended. But that's as far as you can go. You can't just keep going down that rabbit trail, all right? There is actually a limit. But if that gets seconded and approved, then it has to be, that changes the motion to amend, which then has to be, you have to come back all the way up to the top of the line before that all gets approved. It can get to be very confusing, and luckily you have people follow along with pens tracking all of that to make sure that it all happens correctly. A couple of other subsidiary motions I want to mention. The one that gets misused most often is the motion to table. If you say, I want to table this issue, I want to make a motion to table, most people think that you are postponing this to a later date, and that's not correct. A motion to lay on the table specifically is designed to deal with emergency situations. So if a mountain lion comes in the back door, we have to have a motion to lay on the table before we can have a motion to recess, so we can all run out the door, okay? Once the mountain lion leaves, we all come back and we start up, what's the word I'm looking for? Reconvene. Oh, you guys are good. We reconvene the meeting and we take that item right back off the table and we pick up right where we left off in the same meeting. If what you're trying to do is to push this item to a future meeting so you can think about it longer or get more research, what you really want to do is a motion to postpone. And then we'll take it off of this agenda and we'll bring it back later. Now, it is a subsidiary motion, which means we've already had a motion, a main motion, and a second. So when we bring it back at a later meeting, we still have a motion and a second on the main motion. We pick up right where we left off. There is a special kind of motion to postpone that you probably thought you were doing when you were tabling it. It's called a motion to postpone indefinitely, and that's a motion to kill it. If you make a motion to postpone indefinitely and you get a second and it gets approved, that item comes off the agenda and we won't bring it back to you. It's dead. Okay? Finally, of the subsidiary motions, let's talk about commit. Commit is often used in the political arena when you want to kill something but don't want to be seen as having killed it. You've seen this before. I think this is an excellent item that deserves further discussion, and I'm going to make a motion that we refer this to committee to be brought back at a later date. And then it's up to the committee to decide how late that later date is, right? You refer something to committee for further discussion, and that is frequently used as a way to stop something from happening, if you're thinking about this strategically. All right. Let's talk about a few incidental motions as well. These I just want to touch on very briefly. I call these how to annoy people, all right? None of these motions are necessary at all. You'll see very quickly why I call them motions to annoy people. First is the point of order. You can bring up a point of order at any time. You don't have to have the floor. You don't have to be recognized by the chair. A point of order asks the chair to rule on some violation of rules, okay? Point of order, we don't have a second. We can't vote on this. Why is that just annoying? Because we didn't need a second in the first place. We're a small board, all right? You're just being nitpicky. Hey, please be nitpicky if you want to be nitpicky. I don't have a problem with that. It is thoroughly allowed under Robert's Rules of Order. But also be aware that this is a less formal body, okay? Same thing with a point of information. A point of information directs the chair to give a piece of information, a piece of a fact to the body. For example, how much money do we have in our budget for this chair that we're going to buy for Julie? Okay. In a large body where you only get to speak once, it's a good way for you to ask a question without burning your opportunity to speak. In a small body like this, you can just wait for your turn to come back around again and you can ask your question. All right? And finally, suspend the rules is an incidental motion where you can make a motion to suspend the rules and then we can approve this item without worrying about any of the stuff. I've actually seen this used once effectively at City Council where we had a complicated series of amendments that we were having a hard time following. And somebody said, can I just make a motion to suspend the rules? And we said, yes, please. We got a second on that motion and we just said, okay, we're going to change this to mean this and then we're going to move forward. And it actually cleared up some of the muddiness. So that actually can be helpful, even though it is an incidental motion. Finally, we get down to the vote. There are a couple of key things I want you to know about voting. First, the counting of votes is harder than you think it is. All right? Typically, the chair says, all those in favor say aye. All opposed, same sign. As an old English major, that bothers me because the word aye means yes. So all the people who oppose it are saying yes, all right? I prefer a chair to say all those in favor say aye, all opposed say nay, and then you're saying no. But that's picky. Going back to annoying people, right? The counting of those votes can be difficult. If it's a close vote, it's appropriate for the chair to ask to vote by show of hands or by roll call vote and actually go down the row and ask everybody what their vote is in order to make sure that the vote is captured accurately. On items where it's generally agreed, there's no need for that. You can just ask for all those in favor say aye, all opposed say nay, and then you move on. Counting how many people is required for a motion to pass is the hard part. If there are 9 members of the board and all of you were here tonight, it would take 5 votes to pass, right? Unless there were 3 of you absent and only 5 of you here, in which case it only takes 3 votes to pass, right? Now, 5 is a quorum, you can still conduct business. But what if 2 of those 5 abstain from voting for whatever reason and you only have 3 people left who are voting? 2 positive votes is enough to pass. That item does pass even though a majority of the whole board did not approve it. In order for an item to pass, the rule is a majority of those present and voting must vote in favor. A majority is more than half. So a tie vote fails. If you have 1 absence, as we do tonight, and it goes to a 4-4 split vote, that's the same as a unanimous vote against. It fails. Like I say, the numbers can be complicated, all right? I'm not a numbers person, I'm an old English major, so numbers are always hard for me. Now, I need to briefly touch on a motion to rescind, because I have seen situations where people made political votes against something that they supported solely because they wanted to make it known that there was something wrong with this. They expected it to pass, they counted no's around the table, and they went, I think, yeah, this is gonna pass, I'm gonna vote against it anyway, not realizing the person on the other side of the table is doing the same thing, and suddenly the motion fails. And they really wanted it to pass, even though they voted against it. There is a procedural mechanism to call that back, and it's called a motion to rescind. And it can only be used by somebody who voted against the main motion, and then it must be seconded, and it needs a 2/3 supermajority to pass. But if all of that happens, then we simply take away the vote that we already did, and we revote. And that allows that person to change their vote in order to make sure it comes out the way they want to, okay? That is different from a motion to reconsider. A motion to reconsider brings something back at a later date, and it does not require the supermajority requirement that the rescind does have. Have I made this complicated enough yet? I've only touched about 10 pages out of this 400-page book. I promise you, I'm making this as easy as I can. All right. The nomination process. Let's talk about nominations because we're going to be doing nominations tonight for the 3 offices, the chair, the vice chair, and the secretary. And so I want to make sure we're all on the same page about how that operates. There's a lot of different options for how you run nominations in Robert's Rules. The most common is what's known as via voce, by voice. And after talking with staff, that's what we're going to do tonight. And so the way that process works is that typically a disinterested person, that's the chair if the chair is not up for election. But if the chair is up for election, it's often, for courtesy reasons, done by somebody else. And I'll run that tonight. We'll call for nominations from the floor. And then it's up to members to just throw out names and nominate people from the floor. Nominations don't have to be seconded, by the way. You don't have to have a second to nominate. If you want to second a nomination just to, give a show of support, you're welcome to do so. It doesn't get recorded in the minutes. It's unnecessary. It doesn't have any practical effect, but you're welcome to do that. It is, by the way, courteous to allow the nominated person to decline. And so after you have made a verbal nomination, or if you wind up getting nominated and you really want to decline, just simply say so, and we'll move on to another nomination. Here's the tricky part. Once we close nominations, and I'll only do that after I ask 3 times. Once we close nominations, we circle back to the first name that was nominated. And we vote on each nomination in seriatim, which means one at a time. I will ask, let's just say, for example, that John is nominated first. That's the first name on the list. I'll ask all of those in favor of John Hayek for chair. And we take a vote. And if a majority of the board votes in favor of that person, we never move on to the second nomination. We're done. Okay? If a majority votes against that person, then we move on to the second name on the list and we ask the same question. All of those in favor of Mary Ann, say aye. And if she gets a majority vote, then she gets nominated, gets elected. Okay? Please don't ask me what happens if we get all the way to the end of the list and haven't elected anybody. I hope that doesn't happen.
We have no chair.
All right. That's different than a lot of the ways, than the way a lot of people do nominations. It is straight out of Robert's rules, though. So if there are any questions about that, I know it might be different to you. Anybody got a question about that? All right, then. We're moving on to our third topic. This is a good sign. All right, standards for plat approval. State law requires that this planning commission shall approve a plat if it meets those 4 requirements. And I'm not going to go through and read all of them. If it conforms to all of those requirements, the key language there is shall approve. The good news for you is that there's a professional staff out here that is examining each of the applications and confirming that it meets each of those requirements and making a recommendation to you. If it does meet the requirements, they will tell you. And if it doesn't, if it's deficient in any way, they'll tell you that. That makes your job almost a ministerial duty. You've been given the information, and if it does meet, you shall approve. There is no deliberation. Here's what I want to drive home. I mean, I probably am already doing it. That shall is mandatory, all right? It's not a question. You don't get to then decide whether you like the color of the houses that are going to be built or whether the road is made out of asphalt or concrete. It's a shall. It's a mandatory. Let's test that with a hypothetical right quick. Local church, let's say, wants to build a new building on unplatted property. Our city code requires a plat for subdividing or a building permit. And our code also requires a right-of-way dedication whenever the property is subdivided. But let's say the church doesn't want to subdivide their property. They just want to build a new church. Can we condition their plat approval on the right-of-way dedication if they don't want to subdivide? This is not a hypothetical question. This was a real case out of Corpus Christi where the church, the Corpus Christi Unitarian Church, bought a piece of property outside the city limits, then it was annexed, then the church decided to build. They did not want to subdivide the property, they only wanted to build. But these 2 conditions are exactly what was in Corpus Christi's rules at the time. This is late 1960s, I think. The city said, we're not going to approve your plat unless you dedicate right-of-way to us, and it worked out to like 15% of their property. It was a big dedication. And so the church sued the city over it. What do you think the court said? I'll show you what the court said. The court said, this is not a discretionary matter. We, the court, have no quarrel that the various articles and ordinances make reasonable requirements that the church file a plat for its unplatted lot. However, the condition that a portion amounting to 15% of the church's property be dedicated is not by law authorized. It's not in the code. You can't add it in yourself. You have to approve a plat that meets the minimum requirements. That's what the rule is. It's state law, and if we get sued over it, the state will say this is what has to be done, okay? So let's talk about variances, because you know there are opportunities to make changes in there, all right? And our code, local code, does provide opportunities for variances whenever you're considering approval of a plat. In general, Section 21-16 says that when the Planning Commission finds that an unnecessary and extraordinary hardship would result, you can issue a variance. This should be considered a high standard. This should be considered exceptional. This should not be normal course of business. But if there is an unnecessary and extraordinary hardship that would result from us strictly following our rules, then you can recommend that City Council grant a variance. Whenever you do that, though, you have to figure in these 5 criteria. They are set out in the code, and I'm not going to go over each of them. You'll see them every time you have a variance in front of you, and many of you have seen them already. The key that I want to point out to you, though, is that those are high standards. If you look at, for example, the third one, the hardship is not based solely on the cost of complying with the code. You can't give someone a hardship because it's too expensive. That's not unusual, unnecessary. Likewise, number 5, there has to be special or unique circumstances on that physical property which make it difficult to strictly comply. If you can't find those special or unique circumstances, you can't grant a variance. Because you see at the end of number 4, that's an and. It has to be all 5 of these criteria before you can grant a variance. Otherwise, you're stepping outside of the code, you're requiring something the code doesn't allow, and a court would look at us the same way they looked at Corpus Christi, and they would overturn it. Okay? So again, the good news for you is you have a very dedicated, very competent, very good staff here who is going to make those recommendations to you. They're going to walk you through that process. They're going to show you where those exceptions are. And if you follow their lead and kind of see your role here and as oversight of what they're doing, I think you're going to be just fine.
We have latitude in this. It appears to me, I think we have a lot of latitude here.
That you have only the latitude that is given to you by that code. You see what this slide says? If you're going to make a recommendation to council for a variance, you have to put findings in your minutes that specifically say which elements are applying and why you're making that recommendation, okay? So you're right, there is an opportunity for a variance. There is an opportunity to provide some flexibility when there would be an unusual hardship. But I want to reiterate, those should be the exceptions, not the rules. All right? I think that's about all that I've got for you tonight. Yeah, are there any final thoughts or questions from you guys?
I didn't understand that last point you were trying to make about what needed to be in the minutes.
The code requires, I'll go back to that slide right quick so we can see the exact language. The code requires that the Planning Commission's action be entered into the minutes of the Planning Commission meeting specifying the reasons which justified the recommendation for approval or denial of the variance. Okay? You have to state the reasons justifying why you're giving a variance to this property. You can't just simply say, we want to give them a variance. You have to actually define that.
So when
What
we're up
what
here,
criteria it doesn't meet?
I'm sorry?
What criteria it doesn't meet in terms of what's required to grant a variance?
That's right. And it has to meet all of them, not just a few of them.
We're not doing that.
Well,
We
then
didn't
maybe,
do that in the July meeting, or excuse me, the last meeting we had.
well, John, then maybe what I'm suggesting is now's a good time to start.
Cross the Ts and dot the Is.
That's right. Remember, the goal tonight is to provide that good foundation. This is not going to be the only time this year that we're coming to you and saying, you need to be doing things this way or that way. Because remember, we're setting the foundation for those changes that are going to be coming down the road. That horizon is going to be approaching pretty quickly. And when that hits, we're going to be having to deal with a lot of change. We want to make sure that we're all on the same page and we're all ready to move forward before that gets here.
Will we have you and/or Allison to help hold us accountable on these types of things, making sure we document and whatnot, just as we're kind of moving forward, learning to manage this process correctly?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Allison will be here at each of the Planning Commission meetings as she has been in the past. She'll be taking a more active role, I think. All right. Well, if there are no further questions or final thoughts, let me move on, because the next item on your agenda is the one I said I was going to help you with, which is the nomination of officers. And so we'll walk through that process, and I'm going to start with nominations for the chairperson, all right? And we will take nominations, and you're going to help me by writing down the names in the right order. Thank you.
I nominate Ms. Wyatt.
So we have a nomination. I'm formally opening nominations, and we have a nomination for Ms. Wyatt. Thank you. And I don't see her denying. So are there any others? Are there
Nominate
any?
Joe Trevino, please.
Jill Trevino, thank you. Are there any others? Are there any others? Told you I'd ask 3 times. That's what the rules require. Okay, so I'm closing nominations, and we've returned to the top of the list, and the first thing we do is we vote all of those in favor of Mary Ann Wyatt for chairperson. Say aye.
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 Any opposed? Say nay. Congratulations, Mary Ann. You've just been appointed to Chair of the Planning Commission. And at this point, Mary Ann, I'm going to turn it over to you and allow you to decide, do you want me to continue to run the nomination process? Since you're not in consideration for any of the other offices, it's not a conflict, and you can do it yourself, or you can allow me to continue.
I'd let you go ahead and do it.
All right, then we're now opening nominations for Vice Chair of the Planning Commission. Are there any nominations?
Again, nominate Joe Trevino.
Jill Trevino. Are there any others? Are there any others? I'm closing nominations for Vice Chair. We'll return to the top of the list. All those in favor of Jill Trevino for Vice Chair, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, say nay. Congratulations, Jill. We have one more office, and that is the Secretary of the Planning Commission. So I'll open nominations for Secretary for Planning Commission.
I nominate James Johnson.
James Johnson is in nomination. Are there any others? Are there any others? We return back to the top of the list. Are all those in favor of electing James Johnson to be the Secretary of the Planning Commission? Say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, say nay. Congratulations. That concludes my portion of the meeting. Mary Ann, you are now officially in charge. You're the Planning Commission Chair, and the meeting is yours.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank everyone.
very
Thank you.
interesting.
That was good.
Yes, it was.
Next item on the agenda is approval of the meeting minutes of the July 19th, 2018 meeting. Has everyone had a chance to review the minutes? Do I hear a motion?
I move we accept the minutes as written.
Second.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
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 Next item, is there anyone in the audience that would like to address the board tonight on any issue? I don't see anyone. Next item on the agenda is development reviews, formal action. The first item is the Covey at Quail Creek.
We have a preliminary plat and a final plat for the Covey at Quail Creek. The preliminary plat, the Covey at Quail Creek, is proposed preliminary plat of 6.59 acres. The subject property is bounded by Turkey Lane, Dove Drive, and Warehouse Road, located north of the intersection of Business 59 and Zach Lentz Parkway in the city's extraterritorial jurisdiction. The property is undeveloped and is being platted into 21 single-family residential lots within Block 1. The development of the Covey at Quail Creek shall be completed in 2 phases. Access to the subdivision will be provided via local streets, Turkey Lane, Warehouse Road, and Dove Drive. The final plat, Phase 1 of the Covey at Quail Creek, is a proposed final plat of 3.51 acres. The subject property is bounded by Turkey Lane, Dove Drive, and Warehouse Road, located north of the intersection of Business 59 and Zach Lentz Parkway in the city's extraterritorial jurisdiction. The property is undeveloped and is being platted into 11 single-family residential lots within Block 1. Access to the subdivision will be provided via local streets, Turkey Lane, Warehouse Road, and Dove Drive. Infrastructure for the preliminary plat. Water service will be provided by Quail Creek Municipality Utility District by an existing 6-inch water line in Turkey Lane, an existing 6-inch water line in Dove Drive, and a proposed 6-inch water line in Warehouse Road. Sewer. The sanitary sewer service will be provided by an existing 10-inch sanitary sewer line in Dove Drive and a proposed 8-inch sanitary sewer line in Warehouse Road Lane. In Turkey Lane. Streets are Turkey Lane with an existing local street with a 60-foot right-of-way, Dove Drive, which is an existing local street with 60 feet of right-of-way, Warehouse Road, which is an existing local street with 60 feet of right-of-way. Drainage is in accordance with the master drainage plan of the City of Victoria. The final plat, water service will be provided by Quail Creek Municipality Utility District by an existing 6-inch water line in Turkey Lane and an existing 6-inch water line in Dove Drive. Sanitary sewer service will be provided by Quail Creek Municipality Utility District by a 10-inch sanitary sewer line in Dove Drive and an 8-inch sanitary sewer line in Turkey Lane. Existing streets are Turkey Lane, Dove Drive, and Warehouse Road with all 60 feet of right-of-way. Drainage is in accordance with the master drainage plan of the City of Victoria. Staff recommends that the proposed preliminary and final plat, Phase 1 of the Covey at Quail Creek, are in compliance with the minimum requirements for single-family residential development contained within the subdivision and development regulations. Staff recommends approval of the preliminary plat for the Covey at Quail Creek and the final plat for the Covey at Quail Creek Phase 1, finding they meet all applicable ordinance and regulations.
Thank you. At this time, we'd open up public hearing for the preliminary plat. Is there anyone here that'd like to address it? I don't see anyone. Do y'all want to discuss the preliminary plat? Is everybody in, do I hear a motion to adopt the preliminary plat? Approve it, I'm sorry.
I move to approve the preliminary and final plats.
I
I think we
second.
need to do it one at a time,
Is it one at a time?
right? Or can we do it
I saw-
together?
Yeah.
They're separate on the agenda, so let's adopt the preliminary plat first. We have a motion, do we have a second?
Second.
All in favor of adopting the preliminary plat? Say aye. Anyone opposed? Nay? It's been adopted. Okay, do we have a motion on adopting the final plat?
I move to approve the final plat.
Second?
Second.
All in favor? Say aye, please.
Aye.
Any opposed? It's done. The next item on the agenda is the Development Services Monthly Development Report.
The monthly development report, we've had 2 minor plats in the month of August, 2 major plats, 4 site plans, and 2 items that went to council in August. Both were approved and passed. Our monthly development permit report, we are still above our numbers from last year, from 2017. Any questions in regards to the reports?
Any questions from anyone? No, thank you. I believe, I guess, is it an agenda item, or are we just going to announce that the October meeting will be changed to October 11th?
It's pretty much just an announcement. We will be at the state conference for our regularly scheduled October meeting. We'll be at all of the staff will be at a state conference, so we will be moving the meeting up a week on October 11th. If we have any agenda items, the deadline for that agenda is on Monday.
Okay, thank you. Is there anything else from anyone on the Planning Commission that'd like to discuss or bring up? I don't see it. Then this meeting is adjourned. Thank y'all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.